Hello, everyone. Greetings from me, Malavika, Binny, and Angellica.
Hello, everyone.
It's a pleasure to have an audience for such an important topic, which Angelica has titled as the 15 women of India's Constituent Assembly. And quite often, what happens is whenever we talk of women, we tend to either put them up on a pedestal, glorify them as goddesses, think of them as this unreachable ideals. That's also context setting for future women and how we kind of idealize women into these aspirational models that they are not able to achieve. But at the same time, there's a dearth of narratives, there's a dearth of works, particularly works such as this one on the 15, which marries together narratives about women, but at the same time, it portrays women as being truly human. There's no superhumanization of them, there's no idolization of them, there's no reification. And it is very, very rarely that you see this combination at work where women are portrayed as flesh and blood women who struggled, who resisted patriarchy, who fought against the system. So, as I was going through this work, it has been an accelerating experience for me because on the one hand, it inspires you, and it inspires you so much so that you want to get out there and do something. But at the same time, when we go for these feminist conferences or when we talk to female PhD students or cure students, we constantly tell them we must remember that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and the way that have been paved for us. It's through the sweat and blood of women who advocated women's rights as human rights. And sometimes we keep forgetting this. And particularly at a time when we have such an abysmal representation of women in our parliament, in our legislative assemblies, I think this is a work which needs to be read. And as I was mentioning to Angelica yesterday, I wish all of us could actually pick up a copy and read at least bits of it, because there's anecdotal material, there's historical material, there's biographical material, and she's done an incredible job of bringing all those narratives of these 15 women together. So my first question, Angelica, is what inspired you in the first place to actually start work, you as well as Akash, to start researching on these 15 women?
Well, can you hear me? You can hear me, right? Okay, great. Thank you so much for the beautiful words that you have said about the book, and I hope all of you get a chance to read the book. The journey of the books began like 6 years ago, while I was going through a dark phase, in terms of my mental health. And everyone has their own way of dealing with their mental health. And for leisure, I was just going through the Constituent Assembly debates. And one thing that really struck me was going through the debates and reading the speeches of these amazing women and the way they were putting out their thoughts in the Constituent Assembly. The first person whose name I came across was Begum Qudsiya Rasool. And there was this quote in the Constituent Assembly debates where she said the reservation is a self-destructive weapon. I read that line, and I'm an activist, and I'm a representation activist. So I take my work on equity very seriously. And I have been an activist for the last 10 years or so, talking about equity, talking about representation and reservation and the importance of it. And here was this woman who belongs to a minority class, yet saying that reservation is a self-destructive weapon. And that kind of took me down a rabbit hole where I wanted to understand. I didn't want to criticize her immediately because it was in contrast to what my worldview is. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to go through her life story. I wanted to know who she was, where she came from, the kind of worldview that she had because of the upbringing that she had around her, and which shaped her thoughts to reflect in that manner. So that is how the journey began, and the book as the result of that.
Okay, quite very, very interesting. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, this is a work which you will find immensely interesting. Though I'm a historian and I tend to critique more than appreciate, this is a work that I fell in love with also because you have references to Anna Mascarini, who was fighting with Gandhi, who had these altercations with Gandhi to the extent that Gandhi would write to the then chief minister that this woman shouldn't be part of your cabinet. And then you have references to Ammu Swaminathan, who came from a place of privilege and who would travel the world with her daughter. So you don't gloss over the nuances. You do not think of them as women who had this extraordinary life. You do look at the imperfections. You do look at them as women who had their own flaws. And what I really enjoyed about the work was it is intersectional to the core. You've looked at aspects of class, you've looked at aspects of caste, and in particular, when you're looking at someone like Dakshayani Velayudan, or Anna Mascarin for that instance, you do talk about the bigger struggle that they had, the Herculean task that they had at hand when they were fighting for themselves as well as fighting for a social cause. Now, this is interesting for me, particularly with regard to a contemporary history, where whether it is Ammu Swaminathan or Hansa Mehta or Begum Rasool, all these women, they were fighting against imperialism, they were fighting against casteism, but they were also very strong advocates of women's rights. So when we look at our female politicians today, so while they espouse a lot of other causes, do you feel that they are actually also furthering the feminist cause?
I'm going to take your question in two parts, okay? The first thing is all of these women, they come from marginalized communities like Dakshayani Velayudhan was from Pulaya caste, which is a slave caste in Kerala itself. She came from the Cochin region. Ammu Swaminathan, again, married to a Tamil man, a Tamil Brahmin, but she was from Bolgati. Palghar in Kochi. Then there was Annie Mascarin, a Latin Christian, and we all sort of in Kerala, we know the difference between Latin Christians and Syrian Christians and the kind of casteism that exists despite being in Christianity, right? So there was this, even in Kerala itself, we had 3 women in the Constituent Assembly coming from different communities and castes. Dakshayani, her ancestors were slaves to the extent that when she went to college, people expected her to be unclothed and, like Pulaya, women from the Pulaya caste were not allowed to wear upper clothes. They were supposed to cover themselves with beads, and the men were expected to keep long matted hair unclean, and they were not expected to be clean at all. When she entered the college for the very first time, there were a lot of media people standing outside trying to click a picture of her, but she went away from the other side because she didn't fit the stereotypes of being a Pulaya woman, right? But within the classrooms, she faced a lot of discrimination. Her teachers, she was in BSc chemistry, her teachers did not even show her, the upper caste teachers, did not show her the experiments. So she used to watch from afar and learn those experiments. And again, she became a teacher and became the first Dalit woman in the Cochin Legislative Council, and then the Constituent Assembly, the first Dalit woman ever. So these are women who came from different backgrounds, but the one thing that united them for sure was the desire to leave a better India for the future. Yes, they had altercations with Gandhi. Annie Mascarin, a firebrand leader, one of the founding members of the Travancore State Congress, used to get into really bitter fights with Gandhi, and a very shrewd politician as well. Hats off to her. She was targeted multiple times by the Diwan, C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer's people. Get heckled. There used to be people coming into her house and assaulting her family members, robbing her of just to silence her. The Dewan, the Maharaja, all of them were trying to just silence her, but she came out stronger. But all of them, when they came to the Constituent Assembly, they wanted to leave a better India, and they worked towards it with their own ideas and visions, undivided by where they came from. But of course, they were again. As all human beings tend to do, they all have flaws. And we have presented that in the book itself. It's not a hagiography. We have not tried to look at it from that lens. Everyone has some sort of flaws or others, and we have all presented it as historians. Our job is to give people, the readers, the ability to decide for themselves what they feel is their perception. And that's the work that we have done. When we come to today's politics, I have been a politician in my former life before I wrote this book. I was All India General Secretary of the Students' Wing, the KSU NSUI, of the Indian National Congress for 5 years. So I have been in politics for a very long time, and within the political system as well, I saw how this whole sexism was playing out. We are in Kerala. I'm going to go back to the figures here. Kerala, even though the perception is it's a very liberal society, literate society, and I'm sorry for saying this here, but the representation of women in politics in Kerala has been very low. It's in the Kerala Assembly, it has never even touched 10%, and Annie Mascarenhas remains the only woman from Trivandrum. I'm going to say Trivandrum, that's the easier one for me, to be elected member of parliament, the seat which is currently held by Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So, and in the last assembly elections, we go back to Kerala, the Mahila Congress Adhyaksh, the Mahila Congress president of Kerala itself, she was not given a ticket to contest the elections, and she shaved off her head in protest. I think you must have... Yes, exactly. Yeah, so we see these instances of this marginalization of women that happens in politics. It's in Kerala and also across the country. I have traveled across the country working on, as I was All India General Secretary of the Students' Wing, I had to go visit and look at the administration of, the political system in different states. And I saw this repeated pattern wherein women politicians, every time they want to talk in a meeting, men will, drown out their voices. They will laugh over them. They will not allow them to even speak. And when they speak up, they would just be completely sidelined, ignored. And when the tea break will happen, men will ask them to serve tea and samosa to the others. Women were seen merely and is continue to be seen as merely as ornamental beings in the political system. And that's a tragedy of it. But yes, I take into account the fact that there is some change happening, very marginal and incremental change. I'm a very impatient person, so it doesn't really make me happy, but some change is happening, and I think it's going to take a long period of time. The conversations are starting to happen with the Women's Reservation Bill again. I have strong objections to the bill, but I'm also glad the bill was passed after 27 years. It was introduced in 1996. It took 27 years, it was passed, but I'm glad that at least it was passed. And then we have women, we have women in the system who are continuously sidelined, who cannot even voice their opinions. When we have them in positions of power, they tend to, we call it patriarchal bargaining in gender terms, right? So they tend to try to emulate the qualities of men. They tend to feel that, okay, we have to pretend like men, we have to do this, do that, so that they take us seriously. It's no fault to them whatsoever, because it's a way of survival for them, how they can survive in that system. And they're trying to, look down upon each other, try one woman trying to pull another woman down. There's this saying that women pull each other down, women cannot work together. This is a term that I've heard so often in the political system when they say, oh ma'am, we cannot make these two women work together in this project, they'll fight, they won't get along. And it's just how the conditioning has been. And that happens. And when I talk to young women across India, not just across India, but across the world, this question often comes up. Right, ma'am? What do we do? Because women are seen to be fighting with each other most of the time. They are not taken seriously, etc. Yeah. So I go back to the concept of patriarchal bargaining, and we say that, it's how they have been conditioned. For example, we have, let's take the example of a pie. We have a big pie. We cut it into pieces. And we say that, hey, this 33% belongs to you. The others are for the men, but 33% is for you. That's the kind of limitation that has been given. Like if we appoint a board of 10 people, we say that 1 or 2 seats are reserved for women. Others are all for men. But the fundamental thing that we need to put in our heads is nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere does it say that only 2 are for women. The others can as well be for women, right? So we need to get rid of that mindset which conditions us to believe that we have to limit on those things. So I often tell young women that, don't believe in what patriarch is trying to show you. Patriarch is trying to show you just a piece of the pie. Think that the whole pie is yours. Bring other women, try to have the whole pie. Maybe leave 1 or 2 for the men, because diversity is always good. But that's the core idea there.
It's a very interesting allegory. The usual allegory that I use is that of the bus seats, where you have 4 seats up ahead near the driver reserved for women, and the rest are actually open seats. Like in the case of reservation, the open category is open for all, but it becomes a containment strategy. So I think that's
the thing, right? We need to believe that even when we have reservation should be seen as the floor, not the ceiling. Right.
Absolutely. And since you have raised the question of patriarchal bargaining, we also see political parties indulging in gender washing, where, and this is not just at the national level, you see this at the international level, where entire wars have been fought for liberating women. And it is always for liberating Asian women or Middle East women or women not from the West. As if only we need liberation and nobody else need liberation. In fact, there's this wonderful work called Muslim Women Do Not Need Your Saving, which is a fantastic work. And it's also important to portray women not as these victims, these constant victims on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is also a need for advocating state reforms for women, while they're not shrunk into tokens. And we shouldn't let governments use gender washing as a strategy to cover up, other kinds of state excesses that are happening. And when you sort of go back to the 15 as you call them, in fact I like this term so much because after the Hema Commission report came out, there was this talk of the power group. Yeah. And whenever you have the term power being used, it's always in association with men. And then, so that we don't use the word power in association with women, you would see even the best of scholars switching to the term Shakti. And they kind of refuse to use the term power. But if you look at, I grew up when Cartoon Network made its way into India. So I was thrilled that you actually had a series called Powerpuff Girls. It started with the term power. So it's also a kind of signaling that you do psychologically. So when you look at these 15 women, they were powerful, but at the same time, you would also see them confirming on certain things. For instance, as they journey through their individual tracks of feminism, you would also see them shaping themselves as feminists. For instance, Begum Rasool's narrative is very interesting because initially when she's looking at partition, she's advocating for partition, and then she feels that if all the Muslims leave India, and mostly it will be the elite Muslims who leave India, so some of the Muslims have a moral responsibility to stay back and fight for the subaltern Muslims. And then she takes a switch, and then she joins the International Congress towards the last years of her political career. So for me, this is also very interesting because when we think of Gandhi or when we think of Sarojini Naidu, we have this very static images of them and the stance they took. But as people, we can move. We can move from one end of the spectrum to the other, and that's something that you have brought out. Do you want to comment further on that?
Just adding on to that, when we look at the book and the kind of personalities that we had, and everybody has different characters to them, right? For example, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur was deeply influenced by Gandhi. She was Gandhi's secretary for a very long time, and her worldview also was shaped by Gandhi. And she was, one of the founding pillars of India's health sector, so to speak, public health sector. She was the brains behind AIMS, the All India Institute of Medical Science. But on the other hand, she was against birth control. And that's because Gandhi was completely against the idea of birth control. Gandhi had fights with Margaret Sanger when Margaret Sanger came to India in the 1930s, against birth control. So that worldview kind of remained in Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, and as the health minister, she was against birth control, and she was more inclined to the natural way of, what Gandhi was kind of advocating to control birth, and that's kind of dichotomy right there that exists. And it's not just about her. Like you mentioned Begum Rasool, right? Begum Rasool, on the one hand, she was also known as two-faced Begum, right? On the one hand, she was wearing parda when she was going to meet her mother-in-law, but when she was out in the public, she was not wearing a parda. She had discarded the parda. And that was her way of picking her own battles as a politician. If we go back to 1937, when Begum Rasool was contesting the elections then, she and her husband both were candidates for the elections. Husband, no objections whatsoever, but when she wanted to contest that election, a fatwa was issued against her. And the reason for the fatwa was it was un-Islamic for a Muslim woman, for a non-Prada Muslim woman to contest election. And that's right there, right? Religious fundamentalism was also impacting her choice of a career. They wanted to come into the way, but then she didn't really give a damn, and I'm sorry, excuse my language. But she went ahead and contested the election and won it. And she was among the 10 women who won from non-reserved seats along with Hansa Mehta and Vijayalakshmi Pandit in that 1937 elections. So when we look at all of this, it's very fascinating, the kind of. And another facet that I want to, because we talked about Dakshayani earlier, Dakshayani Velayudhan, a strong voice of the Dalits in the Constituent Assembly, but again she was at loggerheads with Ambedkar, and because she was more of a follower of Gandhi. And when we look back at it, it's kind of fascinating because she was someone who was deeply influenced by Gandhi's thoughts. And she, in fact, got married at the Gandhi ashram at Wardha, right? And even in the Constituent Assembly, she was fighting with, not face to face, but her speeches were sort of attacking Ambedkar, saying that you're trying to divide the nation, you should become a nationalist, and she was against separate electorates and wanted joint electorates to be the norm, etc., which was again, when we look back, completely in contradiction to what we know of the Ambedkarite movement, so to say. But later on in the 70s or so, she became an Ambedkarite herself, started founding an organization for Dalit women, held a national conference for Dalit women, etc. So the idea herein is, we all go through phases in our lives. And each of these phases shape who we are, but we are also allowed to evolve and grow. So that's the point right there.
That's a wonderful answer.
Yeah.
So a central thread that you see throughout the work, and I think almost all work on the modern history of gender, is this central figure of Gandhiji, where you have Gandhi on the one side, you have a set of scholars who think of Gandhi as the person who played the role of a fulcrum in liberating Indian women and opening up public spaces for them. But then you also have another set of scholars, particularly ones who have worked on social reform, like Tanika Sarkar, for instance, who have been very critical of Gandhi.
I am of the neutral line.
Where Gandhi, when he is referring to women and women who are entering public spaces, women who were standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder with men, even then these women would be called as Ardhagnis, as being better halves, or as being Dharam Patni. Now you would see this throughout Gandhi's writings, where this Dharam Patni trope is being constantly used to refer to women. So he's a very ambivalent character.
I would phrase it in a different manner. I would see Gandhi as someone, who people often call him as a man of his times. And I feel Gandhi was steeped in a lot of stereotypes. That was the issue with him. On the one hand, I agree that, second phase of Indian feminist movement in that period, 1920s, 30s, etc., the Swadeshi movement, the civil disobedience movement, Quit India movement, etc., right? He kind of asked and advocated for women to become a part of the freedom struggle, and which kind of also help a lot of the women come out of their houses and participate. Again, let's come back to the fact that we belong to a patriarchal society. men would often not allow women to get out on the streets and participate in picketing of shops or burning of foreign clothes, etc. But when Gandhi was the one advocating for it, the husbands and the fathers would allow, like, Gandhi ji ne bola hai, you go, kind of a thing was there, right? So he kind of led to the idea of women participating, and that immensely helped the freedom struggle. But on the other hand, he was again steeped in a lot of stereotypes. He believed that women should only be performing certain type of roles in the freedom movement, masculine roles and feminine roles, so to speak. So in one of the articles that Gandhi wrote, he wrote something like, it is, quote unquote, it is degrading that women have to leave the hurt and shoulder the rifle. It is a return to barbarity and the beginning of the end, unquote. So this is what Gandhi wrote in a magazine, and of course Leela Roy, one of the women in the Constituent Assembly, one of my favorites. I should not have favorites, but I tend to do. I'm sorry about that. And Leela Roy, a revolutionary leader from Bengal, retorted to that and wrote again in reply, saying that, it is unfair. It is unfair that women have been given such stereotypical roles, etc. I'm kind of summarizing. It was a long article. So she said something like, equal opportunities should be given both inside the homes and outside the homes. And if people, when they start a career, be it inside the home or outside their homes, if they're making mistakes at the beginning, it's bound to natural, whether it's men or women, they make mistakes. But we should not be saying that only women should be doing this and only men should be doing this, especially with respect to the freedom struggle. So Leela Roy was a revolutionary who often who would not shy away from calling out Gandhi whenever it was needed. She would just write articles after articles, criticizing Gandhi's stance, and of course, they also worked together in the after the partition and the Naukari riots, etc. They would rehabilitation work in that period of time. But the fundamental point is they were all people who knew what they are standing for. And Gandhi, on the one hand, yes, that was there. But on the other hand, also Gandhi did one amazing thing, which was he wanted to bring more women representation in the Constituent Assembly itself. Renuka Ray, from Bengal again, was nominated as a member of the Constituent Assembly because Gandhi wanted more diversity of voices, especially from the marginalized communities in the Constituent Assembly. So yes, there are certain, we all have layers to our characters, and Gandhi was one of those characters with various layers.
I do agree to that, and I think a lot of scholars would also agree with the same. Now, like Gandhi, you have, Gandhi is someone who used a popular stereotype, a trope that we usually associate with women, maybe to make space for women. I can give Gandhi that much. But at the same time, if you look at a lot of these women were not women that you could silo into those frames. These were very outspoken women. You had women like Dakshayani Velayudan, or you had Anna Mascarenhas, who would not only have altercations with Gandhi or Ambedkar, but would call them to task. They would, for instance, I think it was Dakshayani Velayudan who asked Ambedkar over and over again whether women were consulted in a...
that was Amu Swaminathan.
Amu Swaminathan, okay. Amu Swaminathan, who would ask Ambedkar over and over again whether women's organizations were consulted when you had a committee for the Hindu Code bill. And even as she was being reviewed, even as the people of the Constituent Assembly, the delegates of the Assembly were making fun of her, she stood her ground. So these were also very obstinate, outspoken women, stubborn. And this is something that Angela Davis has also talked about. Florence Given talks about in a much more colloquial manner, where she emphasizes on the whims that women show sometimes. And it is that open up future generations of women. But something that has... that I have been pondering for some time is a statement by Angela Davis, the black feminist scholar activist. So she talks about the fact that we need privilege even to enter the fight. We need privilege even to resist. And that is something that you see in Dakshayani Velayudan's life, where, she was someone who wanted to enter the anti-imperialist struggle, but she also had to survive. She needed her job. So she had to wait for a very long time so that, you know, she could actually look after her family. And then she found a particular juncture in her life where she could actually enter the fight. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have someone like Amu Swaminathan, who's also using her privilege to amplify the voices of those who might not have been represented. So you see all these
Contradictions, right? So let me begin with the fact that, you know, Amu Swaminathan, of course she became, I mean, she married a rich husband later on, child marriage, but she also belonged to a very poor family. And she was just 12 something when the husband, came to see her and wanted to marry her because child marriage was prevalent around that period of time. And when this older man, who was almost more than 20 years elder to her, came to see her for the wedding, to get married to her, she, as a 12-year-old, she put her foot down and laid out conditions, right? She was like, I am okay, I'm willing to marry you, but on these conditions. Number one, I should be allowed to be, I want to learn English and I should be tutored by an English woman. Number two, I should not be asked when am I getting home, because nobody asked these questions to my brothers. This was a 12-year-old in the early 1900s, you know, making this statement. So it just shows you what her spirit is. Of course, later on, because her husband, Mr. Swaminathan, was a very famous lawyer, she got access to privilege, and she used to be the first woman, one of the first women driving around in Madras at that period, you know, learning to play tennis, going to London for vacations, going on a world tour, etc. But she also realized the fact that she comes from privilege and she wanted to contribute to the women's movement. So 1917, the Women's Indian Association was founded, one of the first national organizations that fought for Indian women's right to vote, right? And then comes, you were talking about who else other than her?
Dakshayani Vela.
Dakshayani, yes. Dakshayani was a complete contradiction. She wanted to participate in the social reform movement, but her family was dependent on her job. You know, she didn't have the luxury to participate in the freedom movement despite wanting to. Even when she was elected and her husband and her, both of them were members of parliament at that point in time, even then they were kind of struggling to make ends meet. For those of you who are not aware, Dakshayani Velayudhan was the person who was sending money to K.R. Narayanan while he was studying in London School of Economics, you know, the first Dalit president of India. So even then, you know, she kind of had this immense responsibility towards her family. She left politics because it was difficult for two politicians to raise children, etc. It was high in, I mean, they didn't even have enough money. So she left her job, politics, and became an insurance agent to support her family later as well. Here again, you see, there's a woman who's making a sacrifice to leave her job in politics, to leave politics and help out, you know, earn an income as an insurance agent, whereas the husband continues in politics. So women have often had to, you know, even when they come from privilege, even when they have struggle, it's always at the cost of their own career and growth and what they want to do, because the men often comes first. But one line that unites all the women, because we were talking about the line that unites, was also the fact that they had a lot of supportive family members. So Renuka Ray's husband, superbly, supportive. Hansa Mehta, again, yeah, Surchita Kiplani, you know, I mean, despite belonging to different political parties, people targeting the husband, telling, oh, your wife does not even listen to you, you know what. Those kind of things, the quibs are always present, the sexism was always present, but these women, and they stood their ground. And of course, you know, they had supportive family members. I think it's extremely difficult without that support coming in from your family to survive in a field like politics, even now and even then.
That's a very honest answer. This is work, India's struggle for independence, and there are several chapters written by the renowned historian Mridula Mukherjee. So there's this one chapter which is not so read, which gets the least attention in this book, and this book is a book which most UPSC aspirants have read, most history students have read.
I've read the book while I was a student.
So, but towards the conclusion on that particular chapter on women in the national movement, she makes this very critical and very incisive comment that, women from different walks of life, women who had different ideologies, who hailed from different cultural milieus, all of them participated in the national struggle, and for them, this was also a fight for equality. But once freedom was achieved, they also felt very betrayed. So it's very similar to the French Revolution, where women participated in very large numbers in the French Revolution. But once, the goal was achieved, women would also be betrayed of their share of equality. And that's why, when the Jacobin Republic is coming up, suddenly the figure of liberty, the figure that you see with a bare chest holding the flag, the red, blue, and white flag who leads, she was the symbol of liberty called Marianne. Now, Marianne is being replaced with the figure of Hercules. And this is something that Lynn Hunt has so wonderfully worked on. And Mridula Mukherjee makes a similar comment that, women who had participated in the Indian national movement, women who was part and parcel of the mass movement, once freedom was achieved, the feminist project was completely, she doesn't say completely, that's my addition. She says that it was more or less abandoned.
See, when we look at the freedom struggle, right, one thing was very clear that, again, this goes back to 1931, 1932, when the whole discussion was happening about Pune Pact, separate electorates, communal award, etc., etc. at that point in time. So this was a unifying factor for them, all of them, the AIWC, All India Women's Conference, they all worked together, and they were trying to achieve the goal of India's freedom. When we have that, that was the main target at that point in time. And after that, after the partition, even the women in the Constituent Assembly, some of them resigned from the Constituent Assembly after the partition happened, because there was so much of bloodshed happening in Naukali, and Tripura area. So they, like Malti, for example, Malti Chaudhary resigned, and she said, like, I felt useless sitting in the back rows of the Constituent Assembly when there are so many other legal luminaries who are discussing. I feel that it would be better use of my time if I am doing rehabilitation work in Naukali and Tripura. So there were also women who were, motivated to work there, do rehabilitation work. Leela Roy also did the rehabilitation work again in that area, refugees, resettlement, etc. Right? Of course, I come from Manipur. In Manipur, we see a lot of women working at the grassroots. The resistance movement, is led by women even today. But when we look at the higher rungs of power, there are like 3% women in the assembly. And this is, like I said earlier, this is a pattern where women in power, right? When we go up higher the ranks, the number of women just decreases. Because the systems even today are dominated by men, and men do not want to cede power. No one wants to cede power, right? But men even more so, because they're used to such a patriarchal system. They don't want to give up power. They may give lip service. They may see women as tokenistic beings or ornamentals beings, like I used to call them. But the idea here is between the freedom struggle to now, in the first Lok Sabha, now 1951-52, around 5% women were elected, and from then till now, right, the number is 13%, like less than 10% there has been in the last 70 years. So it kind of tells us how men do not want to cede power, even if today we see a massive movement. We talk about women's reservation. I often come back to this point. We talk about women's reservation. All political parties, every political party, none whatsoever is different in this case. They talk, they make big claims, they announce big schemes, etc. But when it comes to giving ticket to women, they don't give ticket to women. You look at ever since the women's reservation bill was passed, we felt happy that, now, finally the number of women in politics will increase, the number of women will increase, they will give more ticket to women. But actually, no, the number of women who are getting ticket have become, in fact, lesser than in the last Lok Sabha, right? So that is the constant struggle that exists, wherein it's just lip service, nothing's happening on the ground.
All right.
But women's free labor on the ground at the grassroots are very appreciated.
Because, quite often what happens is, even with the reservation for women that we have, the panchayat level, that again also works as a containment strategy. For instance, you will see some of the most vocal, articulate women at the panchayat stage, but if you sort of look at what has happened over the last 2 decades or so, what you would see is, do they progress to the next level? Do they progress to the legislative assemblies? Where are these women? Where do they go?
Yeah. So now there are around 50% women in the panchayats across the country. According to the law, it's 33%, but certain states have adopted laws that gives around 50%. I am of the opinion that it's amazing how some of these women also come up from those levels, and it's not a lot, but some of them do rise up the ranks and become member of parliaments. I have friends who have come up from the panchayat levels and who are now Lok Sabha members. So I've seen that happen as well. But the truth is, it takes an ample amount of time to reach there, because there is no bridge that says that, okay, these are amazing women who are elected at this level, they are doing great work, but maybe we should give them assembly tickets. No, it doesn't happen like that. They're like, oh, let them remain there. Only men will contest at the assembly level. Only they have that's the right, you said, like containment, just to make them happy. In fact, when we go back to history and the discussions that were happening in 1989, 90, right before the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments were brought in the parliamentary debates, if you go back and read, then there were a lot of male politicians who were against bringing this women's reservation, right? Initially, it was proposed to be at the panchayat, and at the higher levels of assembly and parliament. But a lot of the male politicians did not want to do that. They were like, okay, panchayat tak will contain it to panchayat, because we don't want to give away our seats. And in fact, Margaret Alva, one of the people I spoke to her, and she said, Angellica, when I was proposing this, she was it was a Margaret Alva committee that had proposed for the reservation. And she was like, when male politicians used to say that, madam, aap to hamare seat leke ja rahe, which means like, madam, you're taking away our seats. And then she used to give it back to them, like, where does it say in the constitution that it's your seat? This kind of debates have been happening since 1989, 1990 up until today, because today you open newspapers, you open television debates, and you hear men parroting the same line over and over again. I mean, where is the change? So yeah, I'm sorry, I feel enraged talking about it, but I feel that, the rage is also important sometimes.
No, that rage is absolutely important, and a lot of that passion has translated into your work, and that is what makes the work so powerful. Now, one last question before we go to the audience is on the question of carcerality, where you've already mentioned that state ever since its emergence. So I am someone who does pre-modern history. So when we look at the long evolution of the state, for instance, from Mesopotamia, that's where the first state emerged, you would see that it was through the circulation of women, it was through oppression. In fact, oppression of women that the state emerged. In fact, feminist scholars like Gerda Lerner, for instance, have argued that the first kind of oppression that human beings ever practiced was gender oppression, and it is after they started excelling at gender oppression that they started slavery and other forms of oppression. So this is the very first kind of oppression that we are dealing with, one which has about 6,000 years of history attached to it. But the state has largely remained as a patriarchal instrument. So if we, as feminists or people who are advocating women's rights, if we side with the states, and in particular, if you're only asking for, and let me emphasize on that only asking for political representation, that might be sort of like taking a step back, because we're not talking about the overhaul of the system. We're only talking about, making dents in patriarchy through making small modifications to the system. So you have carceral feminists arguing along those lines, but then there are also liberal feminists and intersectional feminists like me and Dalit Bahujan feminists who also look at the state and think, oh, if it was not for our constitution, if it was not for the state, would we have reached where we have reached? If it was not for reservation, would we have reached where we have reached? So I do not think we should completely dismiss the role that the state can play, and the state in many ways has remained as a necessary evil for us. So as feminists, we have had to negotiate the challenge of carcerality on the one hand, but at the same time we also have to work with the state. And the question of political representation becomes very, very important, because we are not just there as token representatives, as you mentioned, but we are also representing the state. So you're representing a patriarchal state, but your very presence also marks a dent in the formation of the patriarchal state. So one has to kind of negotiate those contradictory roles, and it's extremely complicated, particularly if you have an intersectional identity, like if you come from a disprivileged background or you come from one of the oppressed caste, then the dimensions of those contradictions grows exponentially. So how do you think, as someone who has worked in politics, as someone who has produced a wonderful book on women,
and someone who's an intersectional feminist,
as someone who's an intersectional
who has faced
feminist,
racism in politics as well as sexism?
so how do you negotiate these roles?
Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, while she was, I think that's a tangent. Yeah, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur was of the opinion that women is one of the largest minorities in the country, and this comes from a point of view that I want to. When we talk about politics and political rights, right, the right to represent comes a little later, but the first right, that political right that women had to exercise, was the women's right to vote. And we often take it for granted, and even today, there is this false narrative that goes around that believes that, India was a progressive nation. We got the right to vote. Women got the right to vote as soon as the Constitution was this thing. We're far more progressive than America. American women had to fight. Suffragists and suffragettes had to fight, etc. Right? But this kind of narrative ignores the years of hard work Indian women feminists had to put in to get the right to vote. 1917 onwards, Women's Indian Association with Amu Swaminathan, they all went to the Montagu Chelmsford reforms asking for women's right to vote, because until then women had no right to vote. And then they made representations to the British asking for the right to vote. Sarojini Naidu talked about this in the Congress session in Bijapur and Bombay. Then they didn't even get the appointment, to get the meeting to present their representation. So it was thankfully one of the women, Lady Abala Bose, her husband was a lord who made a phone call and was able to secure a meeting. That's how the Indian women got a chance to ask the British for the right to vote. But even then, when the Government of India Act came in 1919, women were not given the right to vote on the national level. They were asked to fight for it in their provinces. They had to fight for it in the provinces, Madras province, Bengal province, and Bombay. In Bengal Legislative Council, they used to hear, when men legislators used to say things like, if women get the right to vote, they won't be able to produce milk. I don't know how it makes sense, but then being sensible is not really something that, that comes along. Yeah, anything to just oppress women's rights. So this kind of the narrative that was going on at that point in time, then 1925, 1919, Madras was the first one that got voting rights at the municipal level, not even at the provincial level, at the municipal level. 1921, Bombay also got. 1925, finally Bengal got it. Even then, these were very conditional. Not all women could exercise the right to vote. They had to own property. They had to have an income. Those sort of a thing, which allowed merely 1% of the women to vote, right? So 1930s, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Begum Hamid Sharifa Ali, Amu Swaminathan, they went to the League of Nations, in Geneva. They went to the UK to lobby for women's right to vote. And only in 1935 were given women, in the Government of India Act 1935, women were allowed to vote. But it kind of reflects the kind of struggle that we, like you said in the beginning when you opened the session, we stand on the shoulders of the giants, right? We stand on them. Wherever we are today, the fact that we are able to talk about larger reservation, larger representation, whatsoever, it's because we finally got that right to vote. And then it's a struggle that goes on and on. So it's a long struggle. Yes, we have to. Even they had to negotiate and fight with patriarchal forces in the freedom movement to get their due. Hansa Mehta used to. Hansa Mehta, you asked for rights. In fact, at the global scale, the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights, it was because of Hansa Mehta that it adopted a gender-neutral language. It said that all men are free, born free and equal, and Hansa Mehta stood her ground and said, no. I mean, if you say all men are free, born free and equal, it's excluding women. We need to adopt a gender-neutral language. And Eleanor Roosevelt was against the idea, but Hansa Mehta stood her ground. And finally, the declaration was adopted, with a gender-neutral and all human beings are born free and equal. So this kind of things, we constantly have to negotiate with the patriarchal systems that we are. In fact, in the world that we live in today, there is nothing that is not patriarchal. You travel in the bus, it's a patriarchal setup. More often than not, women cannot reach the bars. The saying is, we live in a world built for men by men. Women were not considered. We go into public washrooms, again designed. We see a long line there outside because women's washrooms were also not designed keeping needs of women in mind. Car seat belts, again kept built keeping men in mind. So Caroline Criado Perez has written this amazing book called Invisible Women, wherein she defines the world that we live in from the lens of feminism and how it has been built completely for keeping men in mind. So it's not just about the political system, but every system that we encounter, even offices, right? The AC temperature is set, most corporate offices, AC temperature is set keeping men's body temperature in mind, not whereas women they don't take into account that women has a lower body normal temperature. So all of the things that we live in, we constantly negotiate with patriarchy on an everyday basis. So it's just not political system, but we have to live in this world. We have to live with men, and we have to keep reminding that, hey, we are not here to take away what belongs to you. We just want what is rightfully ours. We are fighting for equity. Again, here the definition that we have to keep in mind is we are fighting for equity. Equality is something that comes much later after equity. We need to be on a level playing field to ask for equality. Right now, we are not at the level playing field. Women are much lower. So if we ask for equality now, it's not going to be the same. The increment is not going to be the same. So we want equity first, and then equality is the second step that we are going to ask for.
Honest take on things. And with that, now I'd just like to add to your anecdote of women contesting for elections not being able to produce milk. When they invented trains for the first time, so there were a lot of articles on how women should not be traveling on trains. Of course, this is to restrict the mobility of women. But the justification that they gave was that, trains, they move at such a fast pace that women's uteruses might fall off. When paragliding was introduced in India, there was a gynecologist who went on record and said, this is very detrimental to women's uteruses. So as you can see, there is this common thread where it is always the reproductive abilities of, because that's what the only thing that women are valued for, and it's also a very, very patriarchal anxiety that is displayed when you have these statements against women, absolutely illogical and absolutely misogynist at the same time. So with that, we have to move to the Q&A session. If there are any questions, and I'm sure there's someone.
You can just come up here and ask your question. Come a little front.
Can you please come here and
Yeah.
We are standing our ground here as women. Most male speakers are not allowed to shorten or given time slips, and this has happened to me twice already. So I think it's important to have these questions.
Exactly, because we were like in Devika, ma'am's political feminism and political politics of. I don't remember the exact name, but we didn't get a chance to ask. It was our own session, kind of like on feminism, but I was unable to ask questions. So I want to ask you that Simone de Beauvoir said that when Marxism was when Marx was talking about every proletarians against the bourgeoisie and every slaves against their master. But we have never been able to, put a thing on patriarchy as a women as whole together. That we were never able to do that. First, I want to point that out, and I want your take on that. And the second one is like when you said that I'm a feminist or someone who's advocating for women's right. That itself is feminism, and I don't think nobody here will say that they are not a feminist unless they understand the meaning of feminism. That they are going for the upliftment of and empowerment of women. So I want to get your take on that. Thank you.
Let me start with the later half. Let me start with the later half. I do think it is essential to make a distinction between feminists and people who advocate women's rights. Because I do believe that there is a distinction between feminism and women empowerment. Now, women could be empowered so as to serve the needs of the family. That's the usual logic which is given. Let us educate women so that, there'll be someone at home to train the children. Let us educate women so that there will be a secondary breadwinner at home. And in many ways, state and even social reformers have used women empowerment to further the causes of the traditional patriarchal family. But on the other hand, if you look at feminism, it is premised on the idea of equality, where any feminist is someone who would say that men and women or all people belonging to all genders are equal. So there's a difference there between women empowerment and feminism, and I think that's an important distinction that one needs to make.
My views, when I actually, if you want to get into it, I have an issue with the word women empowerment. I feel that when we use the term empowerment, it's kind of taking away the agency of the women. And I believe that enabling women, uplifting women, it's like, who are we to give some other person power, right? We can walk together on this journey. We can be co-travelers, helping each other, paying it forward, etc. But nobody has the right, nobody has the power to empower anyone. It's taking away the agency. That's the way we kind of...
And it presupposes that women don't
have
power.
agency, yeah. So I have that problem with the term women empowerment. But coming to the idea of feminism, and I would slightly differ from what Malavika has said. My point of view here is anyone who believes in the idea of equality, they might not be rooted in feminist principles. They might know all the kind of feminisms out there, be it choice feminism, eco-feminism, and various liberal feminism, radical feminism. They might not be aware of it. But at the core, at the end of the day, if you're working to ensure that, more women are enabled to reach their potential, they are not being subjected to patriarchal mindsets, they are able to be their own person, I think that's the idea of feminism there for me. When your first question was about proletariat and
Simone de Beauvoir.
Simone de Beauvoir. She didn't mention Simone de Beauvoir.
You did not? She did.
Okay.
How you have a lack of women collectivity.
Okay, that is... people have the divisions have always been created, right? Even in the world that we live in, divisions have always been created on the basis of this. So the women factor has not really been considered as a unifying force. But what we saw in India's freedom struggle, wherein women coming from various marginalized groups and privileged groups working towards a main cause, which is to make India a better place. Yes, they might have differed even in the Indian movement, like the AIWC. They had women who were coming in from the marginalized communities, like Muslim women, Sikh women, etc. And they would argue a lot in the AIWC platform itself when it comes to women's rights. But most of them would also come to a consensus that we have to fight for the struggle for freedom right now, and then our divisions exist amongst ourselves. And I think that's the beauty of feminism when we look at it, that we allow differences amongst us to also flourish. We tolerate each other's point of view. No one is trying to force one's opinion on others, and I believe it's the beauty of feminism.